this is like a version of the talk that I'm giving at DjangoCon in next week, so in about a week and a half. And what's great is you guys sort of have a mixed background. We've got some people that really don't know Django. We know some people who are on every single issue tracker, commenting on every issue that I see around Python Haystack and Solar and all that stuff. So PySolar and so like we've got this like range, this spectrum of like new to very experienced. So what I would like to get out of this tonight, hopefully you guys get something out of it. I think you definitely will. I mean, I've spent a lot of time on this talk just trying to figure out what should I put in it. Obviously DjangoCon, great opportunity to speak. But I really want to get your feedback because there's probably parts where I've hit it and parts that I've totally missed it. So interrupt me at any time. I'm not going to be thrown off by questions. And then at the end, I'd really just like to hear your feedback. Maybe what we can do is, since we have a relatively small group, we can all just go around and you can kind of say what you liked, what you didn't like, and things that you wanted more elaboration on. So one thing about this is that I am in the process of writing, I prefer to write a blog post or a really elaborate blog post or series of blog posts along with a presentation. And I've written the first one, and I'll explain that as I go along. But the general idea is there's only so much you can get out of like sitting through a presentation, and this is only supposed to be 45 minutes, kind of just giving some intros to it, but I'll be actually seeing how long it actually takes me to get through it so I know if I should take out content or put more in. But there's going to be a series of 4 blog posts that will be an elaboration upon this material. So if you guys are interested in that, I have links to that at the end of the presentation. So the idea here is that there are a ton of third-party services out there, and we want to figure out how to make Django play well with that. Real quick introduction for me. I'm Matt Mackay. I am a full stack developer, so I'll go anywhere from the back-end operations, database, configuring whether it's a platform as a service or a LAMP stack, and then also building the application all the way to the front end, if necessary, getting into Adobe Illustrator, Adobe Photoshop, that sort of thing. There's certainly areas where I have very little expertise and areas where I have a lot more expertise. But Django happens to be one of the areas where I feel like I have a reasonably strong foundation because I've been doing this for about five or so years, since 0.96. Seen a lot of the evolution in the community. And in general, I do 2 things. I do prototyping, a lot of prototyping where a client will say, we want to try to solve this problem, let's put something together real quick and see if we can figure something out. And then a lot of oh crap moments where it's like, hey, we're not scaling properly or our site's going down, can you come in and help figure this piece out? And I normally live in DC, and I say that I normally live in DC because I actually just got back about 2 weeks ago, and I was doing this self-titled project, which is Coding Across America, where I road tripped the country for 5 months. And I visited 30 cities. I talked to about 70, 75 organizations, tech startups, accelerators, incubators, and then a whole group of software developers along the way, where I just have conversations in coffee shops and we talk about what technologies that they were using and what I'm using and what I'm working on. I had an opportunity to go to a lot of tech meetups, speak at a lot of tech meetups. So it was a really cool opportunity, and it's codingacrossamerica.com if you guys are interested. One thing I'm doing with this is the trip itself had a bunch of content, and I had a bunch of posts out there and a bunch of pictures. I'm transitioning that to where I'm actually talking to developers, like what's your day-to-day experience like, and what tech stack are you using, and what do you really like about being in DC, and kind of comparing and contrasting that, and then also showing some interesting places to code. So the latest one that I just put up was Vigilante Coffee in DC, which is like a really cool pop-up cafe. You've been there before, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I saw your post.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's so many cool places you can just kind of go. Like, even if I have a tendency to kind of just go to those places sometimes during the week if I don't have client meetings or something like that, so I can just get stuff done. But also too on like a Saturday, Sunday, just kind of drop in and work on some projects. Particularly if you're learning Django, it can be an awesome way to just kind of like get out of your typical zone and just kind of focus on a project for a few hours. So I'm starting to write some blog posts around that. So let's get into the meat of the presentation, which is essentially making Django work well with third-party services. And when I was thinking about this, there's just so much out there. I could pretty much focus on, for example, integrating Stripe payments with Django. I mean, that one service could have a whole series of presentations. So this is going to be a fairly high level presentation, and it has actually it has 4 parts. But first off, I want to talk about why you guys should care about this. And the main reason is because it's your app, and so your app is working with all these third-party services, and that means that it's your responsibility when things go wrong or things break. And so it's better to think through these things ahead of time than it is just to have things crap out on you in production, and all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to swap this thing out. And I saw this post on Hacker News, which basically said, well, it was a Heroku is down post. And someone said, well, when Heroku's down, it shouldn't just take my app down. They should put up a static page and say, Heroku's down. And that way people will know, like, it's not my fault. And someone's like, of course it's your fault. It doesn't matter whether Heroku's down or not. It's your app. People don't know what Heroku is. They don't need to know what Heroku is. Just because you're using it to host your website, no one cares about that. So you need to take care of the third-party services that you use, whether that's a platform as a service or your payment processing or what have you. Heroku doesn't go down, by the way. We just deployed a new Motley Fool site on it. It doesn't deploy. It doesn't go down anymore. But you guys are using it too. So.
It goes down all the time.
Are they still in one availability zone?
I don't know about that. Anyway, service usage is increasing. Really, this is, there's more services coming out all the time. I wouldn't think about building my own analytics or rather monitoring platform instead of using, say, New Relic or Copper Egg. I would integrate that into my app. The thing is, though, that there are things that you need to think through when you're actually going to use that service, and you need to think about alternatives just in case the service doesn't develop in the way that's right for your app. And I really do think this is the meat of the presentation. There's little things you can do to prevent big headaches. So if you just kind of do the little stuff up front, you're going to hopefully prevent a lot of problems down the road. And if you can do that, then all of this has been worth it, because you really haven't, you haven't done so much that it takes over, the idea of just what you need to do down the road. So here's essentially the 4 pieces that I was talking about before. So the first thing is discovering new services. And the idea behind this is you just want to see what is out there. Then after you know what's out there, you kind of know the larger piece of it. Then you want to evaluate things objectively. And then after you've evaluated and you're saying, yeah, I think this is something we're going to give a try in our app, then how do you integrate that effectively? And then finally, how do you maintain that code base, maintain that relationship with that third-party provider, and how do you maintain your code base and evolve it so that it works well with that third-party service? So to dive right in, discovering services. This is essentially the mindset that I use when I'm discovering services. I always research new services, third-party services. So I'm talking about something like a New Relic or Stripe or Twilio. I'm researching what are the alternatives, what's out there in different categories, just to sort of like find out about what's going on. And I research it when I'm not under the pressure to integrate. Because so often we're trying to just build an app, just get something working, and we'll Google, what monitoring solution should I use? And the first thing that pops up is just the first thing that we use. We have no idea whether that's the right thing for our app or not. We haven't evaluated it from an objective standpoint, or just discovered it from an objective standpoint. So I tend to just do a little bit of research, and I'll show you there's 2 ways that I tend to do that. But first off, I asked, what problem can this service potentially solve? So there's so many times when you see something and you're like, ooh, that looks really cool. Like, look at all these like shiny graphs and stuff like that. But you're like, well, wait, how would I actually use this in practice? And so just thinking through, okay, I've discovered a service and this is something that I could potentially use. What type of problem can this solve down the road? I really like to find out what the background and philosophy of a service is. And that sounds really like high level and fluffy, but the general idea is services were created to solve a problem. They were usually created to solve a developer's itch. So I'll give you a concrete example. New Relic for monitoring started up at the application level stack, and it sort of worked its way down. It's gotten into database transactions, and it's working its way down more into the server level. So if you're looking at things from, how do I instrument my application and figure out if my application is working properly? that's fantastic. But if you're doing more DevOps work, that may not be the right solution for you. So when I was on my road trip, I talked to a company in Austin, Texas, and they're called Copper Egg. And they started from the exact opposite place. They started at the very low level, CPU monitoring, network monitoring, just everything from a very low level perspective, and they've gradually been working their way up. So DevOps people really love it because they can deploy something new to production and immediately get feedback on whether that actually worked or not. So they can try things in real time. So if you know the general philosophy behind what sort of itch the developers are trying to scratch, you're going to get away from that sort of impedance mismatch between what problem you're trying to solve and what problem the service is trying to solve. So it could sound like I need a monitoring solution, but really there's more nuance to it than that. I really like developers who are open about their solution approach. So sometimes you hear there's so much magic going on behind the scenes of our service, but really a lot of these problems can be boiled down into pretty fundamentally simple solutions. And so if a developer is not really open about how they're solving it, they may be doing things in a way that you wouldn't necessarily approach the problem in the same way. The idea behind a service is really to save you time from re-implementing what someone else has done. And you're saving that time, and you're just paying some sort of monthly fee or an ongoing service fee in order for you to not have as many developers or you not to have to worry about that. If someone's not being open with you, then you're going to have to question whether open with you with regards to their solution approach, not necessarily how absolutely everything is implemented, but just in general about their solution approach, then I would question whether that's a service provider you really want to work with long term, or that you even really want to evaluate for integration in your app. I have a ton of bookmarks and links of arguments for and against different services, and I oftentimes don't even read them when I am just first discovering services. I like to keep them for later, just in case. If there's arguments for and against Heroku, I'm not necessarily going to remember them when I'm looking at evaluating Heroku objectively, but I'd like to go back to them later. That way I have them saved. I can just search, okay, here's all the list of things that I've seen over time. And you just kind of collect these things, arguments for and against. Some of them will be relevant and other ones won't, but at least you have a chance to really think through them when you're figuring out whether it's something that you want in your app or not. Are there any questions so far on just the general mindset behind this? Okay, now specific tangible examples. I like two types of sources for figuring out what services are out there. The first would be push sources. So this is something where I'm getting emails into my inbox and I'm seeing new services and also, in general, Python-specific API bindings that allow me to use a service more readily. And so LeanStack is something that generally will talk about services and their approach and what they're using, and just it'll tell you about new services that are out, and they have a weekly newsletter that'll just go into your inbox. On the flip side of that is that's just general. Then you have more Python-specific things. So Python Weekly, PyCoders Weekly, and the Django Roundup, these are links in the presentation. They're going to give you information about, hey, somebody just wrote a new API binding for, Copper Egg, and therefore you can take a look at it and say, okay, is this a first-party service, first-party library? Is this something that someone wrote because they were trying to figure out a way to solve a problem with the service? And you can just kind of collect these things, and I don't read them as they come into my inbox. I tend to just filter through them for like an hour, but at least they're kind of just constantly pushed to you so that you can see what's new and what's upcoming. The second way is I have a few sources that I go to constantly, and I say what's out there, what's new, and one of them is actually the Heroku add-ons. Now this is going to give you things that are services that are specific to Heroku, like analytics and caching, but usually these service providers provide a non-Heroku version of their service. So for example, New Relic has a Heroku specific version, and they have a non-Heroku version of their service. So you can just sort of see a bunch of services all at once. Another one is the Gecko board widgets. So Gecko board is essentially like a dashboard for bringing together a lot of different services that you're using. But I actually find it is really great because they constantly are adding new widgets, and I can constantly find out about new services. So like when I was scrolling through here, I was like, I've never heard of that. That's actually really interesting. And so you can just kind of very quickly go through a huge number of third-party services and find out what's there and what you may have missed. There's things that have been out there for years that I had never heard of, and all of a sudden, oh, okay, that sounds really interesting. I've actually written something myself to solve that, but maybe next time I'd use a third-party service for that. And then similarly, Duxboard integrations is another one that's similar. So I tend to just browse these occasionally, and I get a bunch of push inbox notifications, emails from different services, and that allows me to just very quickly at a glance just discover like what's out there and just generally be knowledgeable about the services that are offered and their competitors. Okay, so I'm going to go into evaluation. Any questions on discovering? So I wrote a whole blog post with all that summarized. It's on mattmackay.com, and I have more detail that I go into with that. That's just sort of at a very high level some of the sources that I use to discover services. So from an evaluation perspective, this is where we've shifted from, we've got this big bucket of all these services we can potentially use, and we're moving into, I actually have a problem that I need to solve. And so at this point, what I'm doing is I'm saying, what are some specific questions I can ask to figure out whether this is a good service to use with Django? And there's a few things in particular. There's like a checklist that I basically use. And one of the top things is like, what language tutorials do they provide? And this is a fairly generic checklist, and I'll go into specific examples of services after this. But if they don't offer any language tutorials in Python or Django specific tutorials, and they're only in Ruby and PHP, I'm thinking they probably don't even have any Python guys on staff. And this is the case with a lot of services. They're built on Ruby on Rails. They offer a RESTful web service, but they only have official party bindings, library bindings in Ruby. And you're like, well, do I have to rewrite everything myself in Python in order to use it, and then I have to maintain it? Because that should be a part of the third-party service that's being offered. Because if their API changes, you're going to be on the hook for rewriting some of those bindings. If your company and your organization wants to take that responsibility for writing those things for the open source community, awesome. But you should go into that knowing that ahead of time. The same thing with what ecosystem is their platform built on. So some companies, huge Python group of developers, they're going to very quickly be able to answer your questions about how do I integrate this with my Flask app, or how am I going to be able to integrate this with Django. But if they're built completely, if they're a complete Ruby on Rails shop, then they may say, we're not that really familiar with Python, and we're not planning to hire any Python guys, so maybe somebody in the open source community knows. And personally, when I'm building an application, particularly something that if there's monetary transactions going through, I want to make sure that I can fall back on that company if I have questions about the integration. And then developer evangelists. So this is something that's become more popular in recent days, where they'll actually have just teams of developers that'll be at conferences. So for example, Ken Wrights, he's local to the DC area, but he travels all the time for Heroku, and he basically is like the Python overlord, and he will build libraries that make it easier for Python developers to work with Heroku. So that's great. You can just reach out to him and say, hey, I'm having this problem, and he can refer you to a blog post, or he can answer your response. And they're essentially the frontline service, but these guys are really, really smart, and they understand not only the platform, but they were hired for their expertise in that language. And if that's in Python Django, that's fantastic. You have a person that you can contact, or a team of people that you can contact that are going to be able to answer your questions. So, specific examples. Twilio, how many of you guys know what Twilio is? Okay, so Twilio is an abstraction layer upon older telecommunications infrastructure that allows you to very quickly make a phone call, send a text message, send a picture message, all over existing telecommunications infrastructure. And their monetary, the way that they charge is through the number of transactions that you're making. So as your service scales, you're paying them more money, but the idea is you should hopefully be making more money off of your service, therefore it's a win-win situation. So they're aligned with your business interest. As you grow, then they'll charge you more on a per transaction basis. They have tutorials in Python. their platform is built in Python. They actually have, when you go to Twilio on GitHub, they have Django projects that are already set up and exactly how you would do certain things in Python and Django. And just having that from a first-party service, from the actual source, is fantastic, because then you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to go find third-party services. And they also have a really active developer evangelist community that's out there that you can reach out to if you have problems with the service, or if your company is trying to scale and you're hitting certain infrastructure challenges, they can work with you on that. So when you go, for example, to this is Twilio's GitHub page, you'll see Twilio Python. So it's basically just, here's how you do this stuff in Python. Here's our, we have an official Python binding for using our service, and here's an example application that uses that, and then you can base a lot of your application on that.
If anyone had to call the phone number to get up, that is Twilio. It answers and sends me a text message that someone's downstairs. So
Did you guys write that in-house?
yeah, but it uses Twilio Python, and it's a
That's
fantastic service. So,
Nice.
I was wondering.
Yeah.
So as far as Python community goes, and an evaluation of should I use something like Twilio in my Django application, and this is a really good use case where you say, man, these guys are really checking all the boxes. They're built in Python. They've got a ton of smart Python people. They hire some of the best Python people. They've got all this great open source code out there. You know that if you're writing a Python-based application, you're going to be able to interface really well with what they've written. So another one is Stripe. And so I'm using fairly large, well-known examples, and then I'll go into some newer ones. But Stripe is for payment processing. So obviously a really critical piece of your application. If your payment processing goes down, that's going to be a real issue. You're going to start losing money if you're trying to charge for transactions. So they actually are built on Ruby and CoffeeScript, but from day one, they launched with Ruby. Here's how you do this in Ruby. Here's how you do it in Python. Here's how you do it in PHP. They recognized that multiple types of web applications were going to be, multiple web application ecosystems were going to be using their payment processing system. So they built that in up front. And they don't have first party, at least from their let's see. So this is their tutorial where you just click on Python and they'll show you an example for how you do it in Python. They don't have any first party examples from their GitHub page, but there's a ton of open source ones, third party ones that they have on their website. So okay, that's probably a pretty good middle ground, that they still recognize that a lot of people are writing Python and Django applications and are interfacing with their APIs. So Intercom.io. Intercom is a customer engagement third-party service. So essentially what you do is you send them information about your users, and then anytime your users log into the application, they essentially are creating this aggregate profile of who your users are based on their email addresses. They pull in all sorts of other data sources, and they give you very fine-grained information into what the location of that user is, and all sorts of. Actually, it gets a little bit creepy at some points because it's really accurate. All the information that they can present about a user based just on their email. But the idea is that they're a customer engagement platform, so you can very easily email people for, you haven't used the app in 2 weeks. Hey, are you still considering using our application? Would you like another 2-week trial period? That sort of thing. So you can bring people back into the application. They're built on Ruby on Rails. They have third-party open source Django application examples, but they also write publicly, and this is okay. I mean, they're open about their plans, but they write openly that they're still evolving their business model. They're still evolving their plans for their platform. So the question is, if you're going to be aggregating all this user data in their system, what I would say is there a fallback plan? Is there something we can potentially switch over to that's not going to completely eliminate our ability to engage with our customers, and that we can at least somehow have that data in a separate source, even if it's temporarily. I hate Excel, but even if you could throw that data in Excel just for the time being, and then maybe write a really quick web application that would allow you to do something rough but similar, I would at least just have a fallback plan in case they deprecate something about their API, or they're just not, their new version of their platform just doesn't work as well with Python. It's about having that backup plan because you just know that there are some mismatch between your Django application and the way that their ecosystem is evolving, and that they're really built on Ruby and they're not really as invested in the Python community.
We use it in our app, and we've been getting some misinformation lately from it. Like, it's saying that users are logged in when we know those users aren't.
Mm-hmm.
So, because we've had the open source Django examples weren't the greatest, we kind of had to do it ourselves, and now we're kind of facing some consequences from it.
Yeah,
So,
and that's exactly what this is about, right? It's, if you're just building a really simple web application and you're just trying to throw some things together, you're not really worried about the long-term viability of the Intercom platform. But if you are charging significant sums of money to your users, or to people that want to engage with your users, that's an ongoing business concern. And so if that all of a sudden one day shut off, what are you going to do about it so that your business suddenly doesn't just come crashing down? That's something that you really need to evaluate. And if it's also giving you wrong information because it's configured incorrectly or something's going on, well then, is that causing enough pain where you actually need to switch off of it? And so thinking about that ahead of time can be really important. This is their open source page. I have an example of this just because they're really focused on iOS and on Rails, and there's just nothing with Python. So that's fine from the standpoint that they're really focused. They know what their core applications are, but you also have to recognize that one of their core application or ecosystems is not Python right now. Now they're going to continue probably to grow. They're getting a lot of press. I've used them for a couple projects before. They have some really great things that they're doing, but I would be concerned from my standpoint that may not be as viable long term, particularly if it's something that again is making money through the users.
I was going to mention that as part of my evaluation is not just do they have, say, a sample project in Python, but was it last updated this century?
Right.
Is it something that won't run on anything that's been released in the last 3 years? Because you'll see sometimes it's like, yeah, they care about iOS. Everything else has been molding for 2 years. So obviously you're not getting feature requests, you're not getting support unless it impacts iOS. Yeah,
so Chris brings up a really good really good point, and that's something that this is part of the reason why I want to get feedback from you guys as to what makes sense and what I may want to rip out of this presentation for DjangoCon. But when I was building a push notification application for one of our clients, it would send push notifications to mobile devices. I used Urban Airship. Now Urban Airship, Ruby Shop, one of their founders actually wrote the Python binding, and it molded over for I think a year and a half, and I was trying to do push notifications to Android devices. They didn't have any of that. Now I wrote code to do that in Python, and then I just did a pull request against it, and people started plus oneing, or they would put their own things towards it, and I knew that my code wasn't perfect, and I would have there was a ton of things that needed to be fixed about it. I thought I was going to be engaging in conversation with them. Hey, this looks really good. Can you put some more tests around this? Hey, it would be awesome if it did this. There was nothing. They responded back a year later. It sounded like they hired a Python guy finally, and basically the feedback was this wasn't exactly like what we were envisioning for like something we would do with Android, and quite frankly it was like a year ago, so I had no idea what was going on, and they just closed it. And I'm like, that would have been a great conversation for us to have a year ago, because I was actually working on the project and I could have contributed back to your ecosystem, and yet nothing happened. I think that's just a really good example of we wouldn't go down that Urban Airship route again. We would go down either a different service provider or write our own, because it just didn't work from a Python. They just didn't have the Python expertise in house to work with us. One example, this is Factor.io. These are a couple guys I met up in Seattle, and they're based out of Portland actually. They have this whole development workflow model that they're going for, and the whole point of this is not to like harp on them not being a good Python community member, but more that they're building a product. They have they're basically two guys right now, Microsoft background and PHP background, and they're not at all focused in the Python space. So if I'm trying to build my development workflow, in a Python application, I would just say, this is something that's interesting, maybe they'll get some good press, but at some point in the future I may reevaluate them, but they just don't have that right now. It's about the maturity of the solution and what platforms they actually are supporting. So it's just something to keep in mind. They don't have any Django tutorials or projects, so if you're trying to work with them, you just have to realize, am I going to rewrite everything? Am I going to be the first one? Or am I going to be a part of a larger ecosystem that allows me to figure out, okay, if I run into an edge case, there's going to be other people who've also run into that edge case. So that, yeah, go ahead.
Since you're switching, I had two comments about the evaluating.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually just mentioned what kind of ecosystem it has if I run into edge cases. Because obviously you want the team to have a tutorial for your particular language, and that's great. But I also look on Google for tutorials by other people.
Yeah.
Just like general blog posts, because they may suggest doing things in different ways that are more in line with my goals, or just I want to see that there are other people out there that are working on it and can contribute tutorials and bug reports and that kind of thing. The other thing I do is I check Stack Exchange sites just to see, is there some horrible, terrible bug that's going to be the exact thing that I want to work and it's not working in that Python, that language binding or whatever. So just two more things that I do.
Yeah.
Do they have something on GitHub where there's an issue that 600 people have chimed in +1 and no one is talking about it at all?
Right.
And they're not even talking to the community about it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, you just don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're relying on somebody else's code, somebody else's hosted solution that's supposed to save you time, and yet you're spending all this time working around an issue that ultimately you might have tilted in favor of you just rewriting a piece of that service and just hosting it yourself. So yeah.
The one other thing which I think you touched on fairly well with the intercom thing, but I really like addressing sort of the concept of data gravity, where sort of, are you building up huge amounts of stuff that would be difficult to move out or migrate? Is it the kind of thing where the way you get your user data out is by making a REST request for every single record for every single user, so you look at it and think, we need to do 600 million requests, and they're shutting the service down at the end of the week because they ran out of VC money, and this is going to get ugly fast. And then the sort of the related thing is just how quickly could you replace them? Stripe, I think, is a great example where you could look at this and say, right now they're good. If you wanted to switch payment processors, there are a bunch of options. There's, it's a solved problem there. If you looked and said, this is a huge analytics thing that we're going to base our entire customer relations strategy on, then, they're not drop-in interchangeable services, and them going down can break data that you collected 6 months ago, whereas, a transaction, if you charge somebody a year ago, you don't really care if your provider that you used goes under.
Right.
And I think that's a really big thing. If you're looking at the two guys in the garage startup there, you don't want to bet something that's going to be really tricky to replace.
Right. Yeah, I mean, unless they're, the only counterpoint to that is sometimes there's two guys in a garage that are sitting in the same space that you are, and you're their first customer, and they're building everything around your requirements. So it's almost like adding two guys to your team. But you're right.
Yeah.
At some point, it's like, how painful is this going to be to rip out? And I actually really like the data gravity, so I think I'm gonna drop
Feel
that
free.
one. Yeah. And certainly Stack Exchange is one that it's like whenever you have a problem, you go to it. But it seems like it's great if you go beforehand and you're just like, well, how many tags does this thing
How
have?
many problems are there for it?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
It's typically posting variations of the same problems
Right.
exist. This is painful.
Right. So let's move into integrate. There's 4 different integration paths that you can use with a third-party service. The first is a first-party binding, so a company actually writes the binding itself. It'll write a Python binding or a Django-specific binding. They're actually actively maintaining that, and that's something that usually is they have a RESTful API and then their own library that you would use to call that service, or they have some sort of library that you would then embed in your Django application you would have as an app in your Django project. The second thing would be an open source binding. So the idea is the company either does not provide a first-party service or first-party binding, or there's just alternative ways that it can be implemented, and the company or the organization basically says, we're going to sort of bless these options as, becoming more mature options for actually working with our service. There's another one called libsass, which is essentially an abstraction layer upon certain common APIs. And so that's sort of an interesting project that has a bunch of different projects that you can use it with, and like Matt's used it quite a bit. So I'll talk about that as an option. And then you can always fall back upon requests. But essentially, if you're going to fall back upon requests and you're going to do anything more complicated than a couple of GET requests, essentially what you're talking about is you're going to end up writing your own open source binding. I mean, if you're going to do that in a maintainable way, then you're going to just end up extracting that code and putting it in your own library. So you are ultimately probably going to be the one, and maybe this is a good strategy for some companies. You become the maintainer, or you become the hub for that open source binding, but you just have to know what you're getting into ahead of time. So I'm going to use just GitHub API as an example, just so we have something in particular that we can look at. So what I look for in a first-party binding is, well, I think it's the ideal scenario. You're not going to be rewriting code when their API changes. They're going to be invested in making sure that that changes, and that they're going to upload those changes to PyPy and that sort of thing. I look for the update frequency, that there's not grime and it hasn't been updated in a year. What's the pull request incorporation speed? Are there a bunch of pull requests that are out there and that are just hanging and they haven't commented on them? People are +1ing them and there's just nothing there. And then I look for outstanding issues, sort of the same thing. These things go hand in hand. Maybe there's some issues out there, people are submitting pull requests for it, but they're just not getting answered. Now, GitHub does not have an official binding. What they have is an official binding for Ruby, because they're a Ruby shop. So they have OctoKit, which is officially maintained by GitHub. So they explicitly show, under Ruby, this is what we actually produce, and we use this as our binding for the API. Under Python, they have a bunch of examples, but they don't have an official one that they are actively maintaining. So that's just something to know. From a third-party binding, so that essentially means that the default option for working with the GitHub API is a third-party binding. Now we have the update frequency. How, is that something that one person started, another person maintains? It sometimes can take a little while to figure out which fork is the one that you should use, unless there's somebody who's really maintaining that centralized project. Sometimes people write something to scratch an itch, and then another person in the community is going to fork that and then continue working on it. In that case, you just sort of have to be careful that you're working with the right fork of the project. Other times, people are just putting a pull request in, and that's going back to the main project, the person who originally wrote the code. I also look to see if a company is backing that, because occasionally, another company will actually write a binding for a common API, and then, so for example, maybe Wikipedia is something that you need to work with, and a company will actually just say, you know what, we use this all the time. Or maybe Sunlight Labs, I can imagine you guys probably write bindings for certain APIs that the government puts out, and that way, you guys are, to some extent, actively maintaining that along in partnership with the open source community.
One more thing that I would add to the list is age of the binding, because if they just wrote it a month ago, then it might look great that they have lots of commits, but it also means that things are probably going to be changing very fast.
Yeah.
And I would tend to prefer something that's been around for a while and that other people have contributed bug reports for than something that's really new, unless that's the only option.
Right. Good point. So from a GitHub standpoint, we have I just picked, this is actually one that I've worked with quite a bit, PyGitHub. And when you look at this, when I did some work with it, I thought this is really great. This is, it's a pretty Pythonic way of working with GitHub's API. And then I tried to do what I really wanted to do. I wanted to do code search, and that's not in there. So I had to use a different binding in order to do that. So sometimes you either have to fork this, write some of your own code for it, and then do a pull request back, or you may even, in some cases, have to use 2 different bindings if you're just trying to get something working together. So this has a ton of great stuff for a significant portion of version 3 of Python's API, but it doesn't necessarily have certain pieces of it. In fact, if you scroll down on this page, they have an automated way of showing which endpoints of the RESTful web service they don't have anything for. And so you'd have to look for an alternative way of doing that, or I actually wrote some of my own code to do some of that. So if you want to do it yourself, basically you do a pip install of PyGitHub, and then you would import GitHub. You would log in. You normally would do that with a token, which for the sake of these purposes, I just, it's a username, password. I just did a, what's in here, what's in this GitHub object. And then I just print out the repositories. So these are my own repositories. And for each repository in this user that I've authenticated with, get the repositories and then just print the repository name. So I have a list of repositories, including the private repositories that I print out.
Are you running a Minecraft server on AWS?
What's up? Oh, I tried to write, everyone gets so excited about that. I never finished it.
That's disappointing.
I actually may do that with, I was going to write fabric scripts that set up a Minecraft server, but now I think I'm just going to do it in Ansible. Yeah, everyone's always like, oh, I really need that. And I'm like, yeah, it's like the one thing I didn't finish. All right, whatever. Because I didn't think anybody would find it that interesting. It's like, you can't really go to a job interview starting talking about Minecraft, although I guess probably you guys. Yeah.
We would look fondly upon that.
I don't know what I'm doing. I'll finish that then. Okay, so another option is libsass. So libsass, they say it's like an object relational mapper for software as a service, third-party services. And the idea here is that they provide this abstraction layer, some level of normalcy to it, some level of normalizing to it. But I found in practice, I actually really had to learn each service individually. You guys probably have found the same thing. Like there's quirks to every implementation.
Easy to use, you still have to go look at all the APIs and understand what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't personally found it to be that much easier than using requests to some extent. It's
For some things.
things.
I walk
yeah.
one.
So let me show you the same code, but with libsass. So from libsass, libsass has something for GitHub. So for GitHub, you would just log in the same way, and you'd have an object for the service, and then you would go and get all of the repositories for this specific user, and then you take the repositories and then give me all the repositories that are of the type where this is the user who is the owner. And then I would print out the repository name. So the difference here, a couple differences here. One is that we're specifying this user. You can't go straight to the repositories. It's a little bit more cumbersome. And then you print out the name, the key, instead of actually just having an attribute that you'd be working with on an object. So it's a little bit different. I much prefer having objects with attributes. I know what's out there. I can do instead of having to figure out what keys are in there, oh, this key is not in there, then having all this if-then type code. In this case, you can accomplish the same thing, but you're just doing it in a slightly different way. And I find that I prefer a first-party or third-party binding. And after you work with this stuff enough, I think most people come to the same conclusion. Yeah.
You might want to add to your evaluating how Pythonic the binding is.
Yeah, it's a really good
You mentioned it a few minutes ago, and you're talking
Yeah.
about it here. And I think it's a good point.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. So again, we get the same results, potentially in a different order, but with a little bit different of code, and we're using libsass instead of that third-party binding. Another way to do it is just with requests, and essentially what you're going to be doing with requests is something similar. There's a slight difference in this just because I wanted to get it done. This is actually going to print the public repositories for my user. I'm not actually logging in authenticating with my username and password. Essentially, we're just doing a get on the endpoint for my public repositories. We're making sure that we're getting a 200 HTTP code and saying, is that okay? It's true. And then we're loading that into a JSON object. And then for each object in the repositories, print out the key of name, and then that's going to do the same thing. So very similar to how it's done in libsass. And the only difference is, again, that we're not authenticating, so it's not printing out the private repositories. But you could certainly do that with requests as well. It's just a little bit more code. Questions about that? Okay. So essentially, those are the 4 different options for how you would integrate that in your application. And again, if you find yourself working a lot with requests, oftentimes what you need to do is, if you're doing a lot of complicated stuff with requests, you're just going to pull that out and you're going to create your own binding out of that. Some tips for maintaining code base. I actually have a blog post and a talk that I gave at Django Boston about evaluating project code bases. And a big part of that is just in the README or in the documentation. I am not a huge fan of a significant amount of documentation, but there are just some things that, like, if you just need to get a lay of the land, are extremely helpful. And so for service-wise, I think that all READMEs should at least have, what services are used, just so you have an idea. Or, okay, we're using New Relic for monitoring, we're using Google Analytics and Mixpanel for user analytics, just what's out there, and then how the services are tested locally. So this is, I'll go into that in a minute, but basically, how are we actually making sure that these services are functional with our project? Who controls the username passwords? A lot of times those can get lost in transition. I'm usually looking at things from one consulting agency completely dropped the project and I'm trying to pick it up. So that type of stuff is really important, so I know who to get in touch with. But also too, these are a lot of times things that are done for clients, and they just want to get to their Google Analytics and they have no control over the account. I usually say that the client should have control over ownership over those accounts, but that doesn't always happen. So it's great if at least we have some point of contact for those types of things. And then I like to have just usually more in like the detailed documentation. Do we cover the full range of services? Are there things that we're evaluating? Are there services that we've tried in the past and that we've migrated away from? Just some idea about what's been working for us and what hasn't, and what do we potentially need in the future. That type of stuff can be really helpful for getting a new developer up to speed on the project, just so that they don't jump in and say, we should use this, and they start implementing stuff. And then you're like, well, actually, we tried that before. Here's the reasons why we migrated away from that. Okay, so this is environment variables. I basically now recommend everything be done with environment variables. I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but essentially in your settings.py, you would have a function that would get environments variable and a certain environment, something from the environment that's loaded like through an export. So if you're in a Linux environment, you're exporting that environment variable, and then it's just grabbing that out of the environment. And if you haven't set it, then it's actually going to give you an exception, and then you're going to see that. So you have to set all your variables. This works really well. I do a lot of work with Heroku, so it'll show me that I haven't set that. Like Heroku essentially does the same thing when you check the logs. I like to do that locally as well to make sure I have everything. That way, if you, for example, want to set debug, you're setting an environment variable, and then I would just have a shell script that would actually export all of those variables. One thing I wanted to note was there's an interesting project called PyPy Notification, the PyPy Notifier, and this is essentially, you can self-host this, and it will notify you when there are updates to projects. And so if you, for example, are using New Relic and a new version of the library comes out, it's uploaded to PyPy, then you get notified of that. And so you can self-host it so that you can just have your own copy of that and just be notified of when you need to make updates. Testing services could be a whole topic in itself, and there's a lot of good presentations and material out there about that, and I have some links to that at the end. But essentially, what I've come to the conclusion is sometimes you just need to separate your tests with the third-party services so that if something goes down, you just have to decide for yourself, is that going to actually break the build? So if I'm going to push a code update, is that going to break my build if the third-party service failed and my code is fine? Or do we actually have an alert that goes out that, hey, this, the build was fine and the test passed for what you wrote, but the third-party service is actually down, and if it's down for more than a few minutes, then someone needs to be notified. Because third-party services, particularly public APIs, can be very fickle, and it can be very frustrating when you push code, and everyone's like, oh, the build's broken, and you're like, wait, what happened? And then it comes back up, and the build's fine. So if you separate the third-party services from your actual code build, you still want to have all the tests, but you would have it running separately the actual build process for testing the services itself. You can also have like a custom test runner that would implement some of that. If there's, for example, like you want to post a hip chat, like TrackMe and they do, they post a hip chat like, hey, these third-party services didn't pass or something like that, instead of like the entire build breaking.
Yeah, like our app is dependent on over 50 different like, third-party services. So if one goes down, like it's not the end of the world, but we need to know. It's not going to certainly break our build. Our app has to keep running because, if Facebook goes down, okay, well, they have like 1,000 other sources they need to know. So basically what we've done is we mock all the data for all the tests, except for, and then we have our own custom test runner that basically goes and says, hey, call that API and here's a list of keys that we expect to get back every time we call that API. Make sure all those keys are in that response. And if they're not, send us an email or post to our hip chat channel. So that we can know, because Facebook a lot of times is pretty bad about letting you know when they change an API, and that can ruin someone's app. You'll stop getting information, you could have a problem, so you need to be informed.
Yeah, I was going to suggest the same approach for mocking things out, particularly if you can separate it where you can basically say, here's the stuff that runs all the time that has these service dependencies, so we're just going to have mocks so that all the tests run in under a second locally. And then we've got the really slow thing that walks through and does a million requests, and then look into that infrastructure where you could say, how can I basically hit the service, get a response, and save it to update my mocks with for some time, so I can basically say, if we've hit Facebook in the last 2 minutes, they probably haven't rolled out a new API there, so let's not repeat this the nth time somebody runs a build and we have an extra 10 minutes because our network connection happens to be slow for a little while.
So that's what ours does. We have continuous integration, which runs our app test, passes, also runs our API test, and just lets us know. It doesn't break or pass.
Yeah.
Just informs us.
Yep, that's awesome. I mean, obviously you guys are have way more services than a lot of people do.
Yeah.
But even on a smaller scale, these things can occasionally go down.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
One other thing I was going to add, just as a practical note, the Python unit test 2 framework has this nice skip if decorator that you can just put on a test case. So you could just do something where you're just going to say, skip this entire thing if this HTTP request fails, and then it shows up in the logs that you skipped 23 tests or something, but you don't end up getting this, oh yeah, and the next thing to try to access that also failed, just like the previous one.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, it's nice you can do it at individual tests or at the test case level, so you can just guard all of these things and say, oh, guess what, we're not running that locally because it would just be pointless, and we're going to waste our test setup time just to learn that our test API key still doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, particularly because if you're running these tests constantly, the best thing you can do is to figure out very quickly what the problem is, instead of wasting time looking at, oh, what are these 50 failed tests, and then realizing, oh, right, we couldn't even access the API to begin with. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Also, run your tests sometimes with the network cable pulled out of your computer and flush all of this out for you.
Yeah, that's actually a really good idea. Okay, so I just have a few resources. This is actually something I'll be fleshing out, and as I'm writing, I have 3 more blog posts that I'm writing about just the evaluation process, the integration, and the maintenance process. As you can tell, there's some things that in this presentation, you could have whole entire presentations on, and so it can be really difficult to figure out, well, what are the absolute most important things that should be in this presentation. So this is the first blog post, Discovering Third-Party Services for Django. I took a lot of advice out of the Two Scoops of Django book. That's something that, in general, is just really great from a best practice standpoint. They talk a little bit about what should be in a Python Python package. So you can even get even deeper into, okay, this company has a Python package for their API. They have a binding. Well, how well is that constructed? And is this something that I really want to base my mission critical app on, if they're not really building their project in a way that, you know, the Python community would find acceptable. Then there's Hitchhiker's Guide to Python, and this is a guide that I'm working on called Full Stack Python. It is essentially from soup to nuts, like if you're configuring a server from, you know, bare metal all the way up through the application layer. You know, what are things that you need to know? What are the best resources that are out there? What are the best blog posts? So that's something I've been working on for a while, where basically just, I feel like a lot of times you learn Python, you learn Django, and then you're like, I've got this really cool app. I have no idea about servers and how to actually deploy this thing. It seems like there's a huge leap between having this app that people think is cool and actually having it out there on the internet. So, cool. Well, any other questions, I guess? Yes.
What are your thoughts on abstracting the third-party service and how it actually connects to your application? For example, if you're using the Stripe API, you could just call their API directly in your JavaScript. User clicks this button, and I make this call to Stripe. Or you could create a JavaScript object that looks kind of similar that you're calling into, which then turns around and calls the Stripe API. So if you need to swap out your payment gateway, you can just change it in that abstracted file.
Yeah. So my personal preference, coming from a Java background, is I hate that stuff because I feel like you get so into these over-engineering cases where you end up with so many layers of abstraction that the code base just gets overly complicated for something that you might do in the future. I think that if you have a lot of touch points and you really think you can have an elegant way of making an abstraction upon that, and that's something that you think is, you know, we're really concerned about the long-term viability of this service, and you can see that ahead of time, and people are on board with that, that's awesome. But I think that if in the Java world the default is more layers of abstraction are better, and I think one of the things that attracts most people to the Python world and to the, you know, the Ruby community as well is just that we do less of that, and we focus on how do we get the thing done now, and knowing that we've thought through some of the implications, but there's no way we're ever going to be able to think through all of the implications. It's more about getting it out there. So that's my personal preference on it, but certainly I think that there probably are very elegant ways of being able to abstract the third-party service, and in certain cases you know, you can do that, and it would make sense.
So you think it's usually not worth the investment?
Yeah, I think it's usually not worth the investment.
So we don't do too much extraction, but we tried the sans abstraction approach and came to a lot of errors because there were a lot of touch points. But even with the ones that don't have too much, it really doesn't take us much time to just write one Python file that we call client, or LinkedIn client, or whatever API client, where we kind of have, you know, it'll go into settings, get all of the API keys you need, it'll host, you know, a lot of them, there's a lot of overlap in the code you'll be writing if you don't abstract it, because it's all calling similar endpoints and probably multiple times, and when you have to maintain later, it's easier to just edit one file than it is to edit, you know, multiple calls, especially because a lot of it's going to be the same. We found that just having a one file abstraction for like an entire API is a really easy way to save maintenance time down the road. Not going too out of control of the abstraction, but just having it in like a client file, as we call it.
Well, going back to our earlier discussion about testing, I think that would be kind of a really good code smell thing, is if you're starting to look at this and say, I need to test this by calling every view on the site, you've done something wrong. If you have that one file and you can basically have the little, maybe is even in the same file as a test case that you can choose to run, or, you know, next to it, but it's something where it's like, okay, give it a couple of values, I can run through the 4 functions that are in here. That's pretty easy. That tells you that you're not going to be sitting there in 6 months hating whoever, possibly you, who wrote this originally.
Yeah. Oh, that, I mean, I think there's a lot of low hanging fruit that you can get out of that. Like if
Yeah.
you are copying and pasting URLs all over that are basically duplicates, or that have, you know, the base of them is the same, then it makes sense for you to do that.
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
particularly if there's something where it's like / like V1, and then you're upgrading to a new version, like, yeah, do you really have to go to the database to change that stuff? So that does make a lot of sense.
Actually, like a kind of two-class approach to your idea, though, where one has any URLs or anything like that, all that in the like base class, anything that's logic specific to the third party you're interacting with, and then any time you want to interact with that third party, you have another class that inherits from that one, and that has all your interaction points. So hopefully down the line, all you have to do is go rip out that base class or change stuff in there. But it tries to keep it so that the interfaces you're still using are in that other class, and it rips out some of that third party logic. So that way, hopefully you don't have to change the way you're interfacing with third party in any of your code besides that layer you can rip out easily.
Yeah, I think it just depends on how heavily you're using that third-party service. If it's something that you're using in one part of your application, or you're running as a background process, you know, no reason to overly abstract. But if it's something that your entire application is touching, that makes a ton of sense. I think ahead of time, you don't always know how extensively it's going to be used throughout the application. So, yeah.
It's also nice just to try to isolate calls to external services and as fine-grained methods as possible, to separate your business logic of your application from the calls to those services. So if you ever do need to rip out or change services, you can focus on the very small methods that actually do that service call.
Actually,
Yeah.
sort of expanding into what could definitely be its own talk. In fact, it was last year, was when you were mentioning the background process thing there.
Yeah.
I think that was one other thing. I think if the time allowed, I would have the integration standpoint is basically how you can decouple stuff that's not absolutely critical. So,
Yeah.
you know, when you're saying, okay, I want to, you know, say that I charged Stripe successfully before I record the order in the database, that's obviously something that's worth blocking until Stripe responds. But if you're loading like a list of, you know, Facebook likes or something on the side, how can you do things
it's a really
like
great point.
carve that out and say, okay, you know, this part of the page should definitely be an Ajax load, but then when I'm doing this, I probably want to use something like Celery, so I can say, toss in, refresh this user's favorites. If the Facebook API is melting down, that just retries a few times and they get stale data for 5 minutes, but they're not sitting there wondering why your page takes 90 seconds to load.
Yeah,
And
that's a great point.
particularly, I think it was Dave Golden did that at DjangoCon last year. He actually had, I think it was an intermediate or an advanced level talk where he was going into all the stuff that they were doing at, I think it was Photozen, but basically just hammering all these social APIs and that would be the kind of thing that would be a great, you know, if you're planning to do this a lot, go watch this and learn the battle scars.
Right. Okay, that's a really good point. Cool. So let me just real quick. I think I actually have Flux on. That's why it's definitely Flux. But yeah, again, Matt Mackay. I work for Excella Consulting. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt Mackay. And there's my email. If you need to contact me, please let me know if you think of something afterwards. I have all my blog posts and this presentation on mattmackay.com. And again, Coding Across America was the road trip that I did for 5 months to 30 cities and just talked to a bunch of software developers, and kind of now I'm doing a little bit more of, as I said, like coffee shop, cool places to code, talking to software developers, and then also just some of my thoughts about, you know, different startup scenes. What's the DC startup scene compared to, like, you know, Austin or something like that? So, cool. Well, thank you guys for coming out. Appreciate it. If you have, I really appreciate further like comments and stuff like that about my talk. So if you guys who are done, you're free to leave. I hate people that keep me late, particularly, you know.
I have two
these
questions.
things. But yeah, go ahead.
As a layman, it looks like the whole stress is on one API. So the third parties don't have any fallback APIs available. If one breaks down, the second automatically starts up so that your application doesn't break.
Oh, okay, so you're saying like if you're using one type of analytics, then you could fall back on a second type of analytics if the first one was down. So I think that if the first analytics is so bad that you have to build in a second fallback, then you probably should just not use that first analytics. That would probably be my way of simplifying that whole process. I think that ultimately would be, I don't know, what do you guys sort of agree?
Yeah.
Uptime and availability for a third-party service, it matters, and if you can't satisfy that, then you're failing and you don't deserve money.
You're technically supposed to software engineer it as it being infallible. Of course, you don't practically do that,
Yeah.
but that's how you're supposed to go about it. You don't. They're supposed to work always. Your app should be designed work that way, but be able to handle the worst case scenarios.
I think the other thing that I would say, it might depend. I mean, maybe you had something like you get some offline data and you're putting it into a reporting thing, and that's not time critical. Nobody else knows if it breaks. Maybe you'd put up with something if it gave you something you just couldn't easily get otherwise. But otherwise, I think the easiest thing that causes problems for you is if something interferes with your user's experience. They say, your site sucks, they don't know about the third-party service, and they may leave and never come back.
Okay, the second question is on the same wavelength. If you are having Django, if you are incorporating payment app, suppose Stripe, and if it goes down, can you have like the second payment option? So if one is down, this second one starts up automatically, like any other than Stripe.
So the challenge with there's two ways to handle that, right? You could handle that where if you're constantly checking Stripe, for example, for availability, and if it's down, you literally don't show that option to your user. It's like PayPal or nothing at this moment, right? Because
Right.
PayPal would be a different service that would still be reasonably acceptable.
Right.
The other way would be, and I think it might be, you'd have to be really careful about how you implement it. The other way would be, okay, we're about to charge this card. It looks like Stripe is down. Therefore, we're going to use, I don't know, Cheddar Getter, I think is another one. Like, I don't know, I was really racking my...
Google checkout.
What's that?
Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon.
Google.
Oh, Amazon and Google, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So those
You can go to Cheddar Getter.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, I usually go to Cheddar Getter, you know, I trust them more than
Everybody does
Amazon.
Amazon and Google
But-
aren't going to go down ever.
As long as you send that payment to like one of the payment processors, the challenge would be if you try to hit Stripe and it sort of half goes through, and you know, it's a question of how critical is it to your app. Obviously payments are pretty much near the top of the priority list, but I think that's where usually it's up to the third-party service to have great availability.
So Django can check like continuously, okay, which app is down. So the customer doesn't need to know which app he's paying from, like to Google or some credit card, MasterCard or whatever services there are, like Stripe. So don't
In
they have
general, you probably just wouldn't do that in the Django side of it. You would have some sort of background process. If you're that concerned about it, you have a background process that's constantly running, checking to make sure that that is up, paying it somehow. And then if you were really worried about it, that it had to go through, then you could have some logic in there that would essentially take that payment and then just check against your own, you know, here's what you're checking in the background, and here's the things that are available. Okay, this is the one we should use, and send the payment to that. I'm sure there's a way that you could make that seamless to users. It's just a question of why is the service down at that moment? Because in general, payment processors tend to have really great uptime.
The other thing which you'd run into is that it's very, I mean, this is just a general operational thing. It's very hard to tell that something is down in exactly the same way your users are going to do it. So it might turn out that you're calling the service and their API status thing is, you know, that's cache, that doesn't do anything, and their actual database is down. So once you try to write anything then it's a problem, but the only way you'd find that would be if you were continuously sending a set of fake transactions and then, deleting them after the fact or something, because it's usually rare that something just completely drops off the internet. It's more of a degraded service, and so it's like everything works except you can't post new messages, which is the only thing you were trying to do.
I think this is also a good point where, there's a lot of tasks that can be done asynchronously. And that's a lot easier, especially if you're expecting that the service is going to go down. So like my wife's business uses Stripe and some other stuff, and so we process the transactions like with the user request. But for things like pushing to FreshBooks, like the invoice, that's all queued. So I don't really care if FreshBooks goes down because the queue will just start working again when their API comes back up. And if it was, depending on what type of payments I was processing, I might not even care if the payments would go right away because I could put the payment processing into a queue too. So, it depends on how important that external request is to the user's immediate use in the application.
The other nice thing is it's so much faster to put something into the queue that
Yeah.
somebody clicks save and they're, wow, this thing's done now, and they didn't know that it's retrying 5 times in the background. It took 5 minutes to go through.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we people who have questions, we can talk individually afterwards. But I thank you guys for coming out. I really appreciate it, and this is really, really helpful for me and for just prepping for DjangoCon and representing DC and Chicago.
The guy that are giving the talk is like really synonymous with not just like third-party services, but like Python, third-party libraries.